The UK has been making secret contributions to Ukraine's war effort, and the next one might just ruin Putin's entire week. A recently revealed document, direct from the British Ministry of Defence, confirms that the UK sent almost 100 of its strongest self-propelled howitzers straight to Ukraine, providing an invaluable boost to the country's offensive and defensive capabilities. The most astonishing aspect of this story is that neither the UK nor Ukraine made a big deal out of it. There were no press releases, no major media reports, no official announcements. Instead, a British citizen named John Felix, it goes by the handle Ned Snow 2019 on X, filed a Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) request, asking the MOD several questions about various arms and systems that the UK had potentially provided to Ukraine. The first question on John's list was this: given the UK already specifies to have pledged all of its AS-90s to Ukraine, I would ask how many does all entail? The 99 in service in late 2021, the total fleet of 136 AS-90s, or some other amount? He had to wait a while for an answer, but he eventually posted it in full on his X account, revealing the ministry's response. The UK has donated all 99 of its remaining AS-90 self-propelled artillery systems declared in the UN ROCA of 2021. In other words, the UK handed over its entire fleet of AS-90s to Ukraine. To understand why that's such huge news, we have to take a closer look at the systems themselves. The AS-90 artillery system for the 1990s, also known under the name Gun Equipment 155mm L131, is an armoured self-propelled howitzer with an extensive and successful track record of service with the British Army. It was developed back in the 1980s when the British Army was looking for a new, stronger, smarter, and all-round superior howitzer to the American-made M109 that the UK had been using since the mid-1960s. A company named Vickers Shipbuilding and Engineering, which had extensive experience in building warships, submarines, and armaments, answered the Army's call. It designed and developed the AS-90, a 45-ton track howitzer measuring up at over 32 feet, 9.9 meters long, 11 feet, 3.4 meters wide, and almost 10 feet, 3 meters tall, with enough space on the inside for up to 5 crew members at a time. Powered by a Cummins VTA 903T 660-14.8 LV8 diesel engine with 660 horsepower, the AS-90 boasts a peak speed of 34 miles per hour, 55 kilometers per hour, and a maximum operational range of up to 230 miles or 370 kilometers. It has the agility of an infantry fighting vehicle, combined with the firepower of a high-end howitzer, with its main gun, a 155mm L39, capable of firing standard 39 caliber long-barrel charges just over 15 miles, almost 25 kilometers. It can also be configured to fire 52 caliber long-barrel base bleed ammunition even further, up to around 19 miles, 30 kilometers. Base bleed ammunition is designed to expel gas into the low-pressure area behind the shell to reduce drag and cover more ground than standard munitions. The AS-90 also boasts 3 separate firing modes: a burst mode, in which it can fire 3 rounds every 10 seconds, an intense mode with 6 rounds per minute for a maximum duration of 3 minutes, or a sustained mode, with the system firing 2 rounds per minute over the span of a full 60 minutes. Other key features include the AS-90's ability to transition from travel to firing mode in under a minute, as well as its multiple round simultaneous impact MRSI technology. MRSI enables this howitzer to fire no less than 3 shells at different trajectories in rapid succession, almost doing the work of 3 separate systems in one. This is hugely beneficial on the battlefield, as it makes life 3 times harder for the enemy, leaving them precious little time to respond or take evasive action as a flurry of explosive shells rain down on their heads. But the AS-90 isn't just capable of dishing out damage. With its all-welded steel armor, which is 17mm thick in certain places, it's also capable of taking a few hits without falling to pieces like weaker, weedier artillery alternatives. It comes fitted with a 7.62mm L7 machine gun as a secondary armament as well, and each unit can carry up to 48 projectiles and charges at a time, with 31 in the turret and 17 in the hull, along with 1,000 machine gun rounds. A grand total of 179 of these systems were produced, and the AS-90's capacities were officially put to test for the first time in Bosnia and Kosovo in the 1990s during the Yugoslav wars. Then again in 2003 during the Iraq War, when 32 of these systems were used to shell Iraqi mortar positions during one of the biggest opening battles of the conflict, the Battle of Basra. Commander of the Field Army at Land Command at the time, General Robin Brims, expressed his delight at the incredible precision of the AS-90, stating, "The phenomenal accuracy of it was way beyond anything that one might have expected," and citing this particular howitzer as one of the 5 big battle winners for British forces. Former UK Defence Minister Adam Ingram also spoke highly of the AS-90's exceptional performance, stating, "The AS-90 self-propelled gun also performed well, delivering a great weight of accurate fire support with 95% availability. But major military powers like the UK can't afford to stand still. They always have to be on the lookout for the next big thing. And despite the AS-90's impressive track record, the British Army eventually moved on to the Swedish Archer artillery system, which brought several big benefits to the table in terms of fire rate and automation technology. At that point, the UK had a choice. It could either scrap its old AS-90s, mothball them, or sell them off to a smaller nation that may not need or be able to afford the most advanced artillery systems. But with the ongoing invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the British Army also had a fourth option. It could simply transfer its AS-90 fleet to Kyiv, getting rid of assets that were no longer needed and providing a big boost to the Ukrainian armed forces, all at the same time. Fortunately, the UK made the right call. We already knew that Britain had sent some AS-90s to Ukraine back in 2023, soon after sending up its new, smaller fleet of 14 Archers. It reportedly sent 32 of these artillery systems across the Channel and into Kyiv. However, with records showing that the UK still possessed at least 50 additional AS-90s, many military analysts began to wonder what was going to happen to the remaining units. Were they being scrapped, sold, or secretly shipped to Ukraine without anyone else knowing? Well, now we know, thanks to John Felix's FOIA request. A grand total of 99 of these systems were sent to Ukraine. It's important to note, however, that not all of those systems were originally in active service. According to Felix, the British Army had 99 functional AS-90s in service. Those are the ones confirmed to have been transferred to Ukraine. Another 37 howitzers were awaiting disposal, meaning they were no longer operational. But that doesn't make them worthless. Ukraine's engineers can either restore some of those older units or use them as a critical source of spare parts to keep the frontline guns running as they take damage from Russian bombs, missiles, or drones. And even with those 37 not in fighting condition, Ukraine still ends up with nearly 100 fully functional AS-90s to strike enemy positions, fortifications, troop concentrations, and more. In short, this is a massive win for Ukraine for several significant reasons. First, the introduction of the AS-90 adds an additional layer to Ukraine's increasingly diverse artillery arsenal. It currently operates a rich mix of systems, including older Soviet-era models such as the 2S3 Akatsiya and the 2S19 MSTA, which are both relatively old but reliable, battle-proven, and familiar to Ukraine's operating crews, who've been working with these systems for many years. Ukraine also operates a range of Western artillery, including British M777s, French Caesars, and German PZH-2000s, along with an increasingly broad range of NATO standard 155mm systems too. The AS-90 brings something different to the table, bringing several benefits over some of the other options in the arsenal. It moves faster than the MSTA, for example, boasts superior durability than the PZH-2000, and tends to tackle tough, muddy ground more efficiently than the Caesar. In fact, it's one of the best artillery systems in terms of withstanding cold, wintry conditions and difficult terrain, perfect for a place like Ukraine, especially during the colder and harsher periods of the year. Plus, unlike some of the older Soviet systems, the AS-90 is entirely compatible with NATO munitions. All in all, it's a real workhorse of a system, an indispensable addition to an already excellent array of artillery. Russia, meanwhile, fields 3 main types of artillery, including the very same MSTAs and Akatsias as Ukraine, along with the 2 S-35 Koalitsia SV, which is eventually set to replace the MSTA, but only exists in small numbers for the time being. That means that Russia has significantly less diversity in its artillery arsenal, restricting the range of ways in which it can deploy its systems to deal damage to Ukrainian targets. Russia still has the quantity advantage, boasting big numbers of both artillery systems and Soviet-era munitions, but Ukraine has the edge when it comes to quality and variety. That means that Russia, as always, is effectively forced to rely on its classic brute force strategy, bombarding Ukrainian positions with its narrow selection of artillery systems and hoping to wear down its opponent's defenses over time. Ukraine, meanwhile, can operate much more intelligently and strategically, picking and choosing the ideal artillery for every occasion, whether it be the MSTA, the Caesar, or now the AS-90. It can also combine and layer its different systems together in key frontline locations or close to big cities and important infrastructure, ready to defend itself or carry out assaults on enemy positions with efficiency, precision, and speed. And speed really is one of the best elements of the AS-90. Will take a long time to transition between travel and fire modes, opening them up to enemy attacks. The AS-90 is different. It can not only fire quickly, but rapidly hit the road and reposition to other locations when it's done. So, before Russian forces even have time to figure out what's going on or start thinking about striking back, the AS-90 is already somewhere else. With this howitzer at its disposal, Ukraine becomes an even more flexible and efficient artillery force, much more in line with NATO standards. So while Russia persists with its wasteful tactics of bombarding the same spot for hours on end, hoping that at least some of its shells hit their targets, Ukraine has the power to roll out its AS-90s, launch reliable precise strikes at enemy command posts, fortifications, or troop concentrations, and roll right back out, dealing its damage in a matter of minutes, if not even faster. In short, additions like the AS-90 are accelerating Ukraine's advance towards becoming one of the most modern military superpowers on the planet, with a force to rival some of the biggest and strongest nations of them all, while leaving Russia looking increasingly outdated and outmatched with its rusty old Soviet relics and unsustainable artillery doctrines. The precision firepower and unique advantages, like MRSI capabilities, put the AS-90 in a class of its own. And Ukraine isn't just receiving a half dozen of these systems, it's getting almost 100 of them, with a healthy amount in an operational state and a useful stock of leftover for spares and repairs. It's worth noting too that Ukrainian armed forces have proven themselves remarkably adept at extracting maximum value out of almost every single armament or asset Western allies send their way. We've seen Kyiv's defenders keep other artillery systems, like the aforementioned M777s and Caesars, up and running for much longer than many Western experts anticipated. And it's highly likely that they'll do the exact same thing with these AS-90s too, ensuring that each one lasts as long as possible and deals as much damage as it can before being retired or replaced. And the good news doesn't end there for Ukraine. The Freedom of Information Act request also revealed that the UK has also shipped a large amount of M109 self-propelled howitzers to Ukraine, as noted in the response to John Felix's second question. The pledged 28 M109s to Ukraine corresponds to the total number of M109s pledged. All of the 28 M109s have been delivered to Ukraine. His third question, regarding 54 L119 towed howitzers that the UK had pledged to send to Ukraine, also received a positive response. All L119 light guns pledged to Ukraine have been delivered. And the same goes for his fourth query about combat vehicle reconnaissance tracked CVRT units. All the UK's remaining stocks of CVRTs were delivered to Ukraine in 2024, amounting to 168 in total. These exciting additions bring even more power and diversity to Ukraine's ever-expanding arsenal. The M109s, for example, are 155mm self-propelled howitzers originating in the United States and introduced to service in 1963. While systems like the AS-90 have since supplanted them in certain countries, The M109 remains one of the most commonly used Western indirect fire support weapons in the world today, with modern variants like the M109A6 Paladin and M109A7 forming the backbone of the US Army's artillery arsenal. The L119, meanwhile, is a flexible lightweight howitzer capable of both providing direct fire support at targets like armored vehicles and structures, or indirect fire to support combat arms at ranges in excess of 6 miles or 10 kilometers. It can be towed by trucks or carried by helicopters and fires NATO standard 105mm ammunition. It can also fire a broad range of bombs, including high explosive munitions, smoke bombs, and other varieties. Finally, the CVRT is a family of armored fighting vehicles, famed for their compact size, excellent mobility, and diversity. The family includes such models as the Spartan Armored Personal Carrier, the Sultan Command and Control Vehicle, and the Samson Armored Recovery Vehicle, with options available for almost any type of mission or objective. Not all of these additions are game changers on the ground for Ukraine, but every single one will help Kyiv's defenders in some way or another, whether that's by giving them new heavy weapons to attack Russian fortifications or additional vehicles for transporting troops and supplies from place to place. And the UK's aid isn't ending there. In November 2025, reports also emerged of Britain sending yet another batch of long-range Storm Shadow cruise missiles to Ukraine. Introduced in 2003 and also known under the name Scalp EG, these Franco-British missiles cost around $2.5 million each. Each one weighs in at 2,900 pounds or 1,300 kilograms and carries a warhead weighing almost 1,000 pounds or 450 kilograms. They can travel at peak speeds of Mach 0.95, just below the speed of sound, thanks to their micro-turbo TRI 6030 turbojet engines, and have a maximum operational range of 342 miles or 550 kilometers. Each Storm Shadow also comes equipped with both GPS and inertial navigation systems, combined with terrain reference navigation technologies, making them highly precise and ensuring that each one has the best chance of striking its target, even if they encounter enemy jammers or other electronic warfare measures en route to their destination. Ukraine has used Storm Shadows on numerous occasions to strike high-value Russian targets, blowing up the likes of ammunition depots, logistics hubs, and command posts deep behind enemy lines. With more of these missiles at their disposal, Kyiv's forces will be able to plan additional strikes on those same kinds of targets, or other important elements of Russian infrastructure, like pipelines and oil refineries, to worsen the Kremlin's fuel crisis, or military production plants to disrupt the flow of drones, missiles, and other assets to Russia's frontline forces. And it's important to remember that all of these assets are being provided by just one ally, the United Kingdom. Ukraine has many more allies dotted across the European Union and elsewhere around the world, from Germany, Poland, and Sweden to the United States and even non-NATO nations like Japan and Australia, all of whom have provided and will continue to provide aid in some form or another. Russia, meanwhile, is forced to rely on an incredibly small pool of so-called allies, many of whom are simply attempting to make the most of the situation and extract as much money from the Kremlin as they can, such as Iran, China, and North Korea. Ukraine may not be able to win this war alone, but with so many powerful and generous friends backing it up and providing all-important, game-changing assets like tanks, air defenses, ammunition, and AS-90 artillery systems, it has an increasingly realistic chance of victory. NATO versus Russia. If full-scale war ever broke out between these two parties, it would likely be the most destructive war ever fought. It would mean the world's second most powerful armed forces pitted against the most powerful, the US, combined with the forces of 31 other nations, 4 of whom, the UK, France, Turkey, and Italy, are also ranked in the top 10 most powerful militaries. On paper, Russia wouldn't have a chance. In terms of resources, manpower, and weaponry, the alliance holds a large advantage, in all likelihood too large for Russia to overcome in a conventional war. A nuclear war between the two sides will almost certainly result in a mutually assured destruction. Yet, despite its current superiority, NATO is intending to grow even mightier. NATO members have agreed to dramatically increase their defense spending from around 2% of GDP to around 5% during the next decade, while greatly improving interoperability, logistics, surveillance, and cybersecurity. So, let's take a closer look at just how massive NATO's military is, how it shapes up against Russia, and what chinks in its armor this massive rearmament campaign intends to fill. Now, one of the best characterizations of NATO's power in recent years was given by the recently retired former UK Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin. In his keynote speech at Chatham House Security and Defence Conference in London in February 2024, he stated that Britain is safe. We are safe because we are part of NATO, the world's largest and strongest alliance, and also because we're a responsible nuclear power. The inescapable fact is that any Russian assault or incursion against NATO would prompt an overwhelming response. NATO's combat air forces, which outnumber Russia's 3-1, would quickly establish air superiority. NATO's maritime forces would bottle up the Russian Navy in the Barents and the Baltic, just as Ukraine pushed the Black Sea Fleet from Crimea. NATO has 4 times as many ships and 3 times as many submarines as Russia. This is an alliance that's becoming stronger all the time. It grew from 30 to 32 nations when it added Finland in 2023 and Sweden in 2024. It has a collective GDP 20 times greater than Russia, and they have a collective defense budget 3.5 times more than Russia and China combined. Plus, NATO has the additional strategic depth of a population of over 1 billion. And sitting above all of this is NATO as a nuclear alliance. He's not wrong on any of these counts, and he left out a couple of other areas where NATO is oversized compared to Russia. Take manpower, for example, and the population resources that could be drawn upon to swell and replenish their ranks in wartime. Most estimates put the size of the Russian armed forces in 2025 at around 3.5 million total personnel. It's unclear whether that figure takes into account its large losses during the war in Ukraine. Although with seemingly steady conscription rates, perhaps they've been able to maintain or even grow their numbers. It's hard to tell. That figure consists of around 1.3 million active soldiers, with a further 2 million reservists and 250,000 in paramilitary units. By comparison, NATO's combined forces number over 8.65 million, almost 2.5 times as many. The advantage is roughly similar across all 3 categories. NATO is around 3.44 million active soldiers, 4.3 million reserve forces, and around 876,000 paramilitary forces. As for the two sides' ability to scale up their forces in the future, the gap is even starker. Russia has a total population approaching 141 million. Of those, around 46 million are fit for service, and another 1.26 million young men are reaching military age in the near future, roughly the size of the current number of active duty soldiers. So, with potential armed forces being 13.5 times greater than current armed forces, there's significant capacity for Russia to corral huge numbers into the armed forces if needs be. NATO has a total population of 980 million, nearly 7 times larger than Russia's. Of those, 365.3 million are fit for service, with a further 11.6 million soon to be the same. In other words, NATO members currently utilize a far smaller proportion of their populations in their militaries, which gives NATO the capacity to expand its personnel by almost 44 times if needs be, a more than 3-fold advantage over Russia. Of course, as the old saying goes, an army travels on its belly, and the more forces you have, the more funding you need for them to be effective. Financial and economic resources to sustain a military, let alone a war, have always been as important a component of warfare as manpower and weapons. And in this regard, NATO's advantage over Russia is even greater. When adjusted for purchasing power parity or PPP, Russia's GDP is around $5.8 trillion, with a defense budget of $126 billion, the third highest spend of any single nation state. In the PPP determination, where monetary flows are measured in the currency in which they're transacted, not dollars, Russia's defense spending is just 2% of GDP. Ridiculous for a country in the midst of a major war. But even using the nominal GDP model, which measures cost in US dollars, it's still only around 7%. Russia also still has fairly strong underlying economic fundamentals, despite all its sanction-related woes, with foreign exchange and gold reserves of over $597 billion. It also has an external debt of $317.6 billion, just 5.4% of GDP adjusted for PPP. Yet, NATO's PPP GDP is almost 10 times larger at over $57 trillion. Its combined defense budget is more than $1.38 trillion before the increased spending that its members have committed to, a slightly higher ratio than Russia at 2.4%. NATO members have combined foreign exchange and gold reserves of more than $3.128 trillion, over 5 times Russia's. However, it does have an external debt of more than $69 trillion, around 82% of GDP. Technically, that means it should be harder and more expensive for NATO to raise the funds necessary to conduct an active war. However, with the major financial markets of New York, London, Frankfurt, Paris, Rome, and more within NATO, and Russia currently almost completely excluded from the Western-led global financial system, the opposite is true. It's currently much harder for Russia to raise funding externally, period. Moving on to military hardware, NATO also dominates in the traditional 3 categories of air, naval, and ground force power. NATO's air forces have a total of 20,376 aircraft compared to Russia's 4,292, an almost 5-fold advantage. NATO has 6 times more fighter aircraft, almost twice as many attack aircraft, 3 times as many transport planes, over 7 times as many special mission aircraft, 5.5 times as many helicopters, and nearly 30 times as many tankers. In addition to a huge quantitative advantage, there's also a significant qualitative advantage over multiple domains. In terms of pilot training and operational capability, NATO pilots generally fly significantly more hours annually, about 3 times the average of Russian pilots, leading to superior tactical proficiency and readiness. This training advantage is compounded by NATO's advanced command, control, and communication systems, which enable more effective joint operations and deconfliction between air, ground, and air defense forces. While a grinding 4-year war in Ukraine has sharpened some of these processes, it's an area where Russian forces have historically struggled. Technologically, NATO possesses a decisive edge in 5th-generation fighter aircraft, with 20 European NATO members committed to operating the F-35 Lightning II alongside the US, a platform that offers advanced stealth, sensor fusion, and network warfare capabilities. While Russia has developed the 5th-generation Su-57, it's not considered a true 5th-generation fighter by Western standards and has seen limited combat use. In addition to greater numbers in all classes of aircraft, NATO's air forces also benefit from a broader array of advanced enablers, including air-to-air refueling tankers, reconnaissance platforms, and electronic warfare assets, which are critical for sustained operations in contested environments. Furthermore, NATO's air power is supported by a robust satellite navigation system, Galileo, which is considered superior to Russia's GLONASS system, enhancing precision and operational reliability. These combined advantages in fleet size, training, technology, integration, and support systems give NATO a decisive qualitative edge in air combat capability over Russia's air forces. The situation is echoed on and below the waves. With almost 24,000 miles of coastline, unsurprisingly, Russia has one of the largest navies in the world. Russia has an estimated 419 total hulls, with a combined naval tonnage of just over 1.26 million tons. This total includes a single problematic aircraft carrier, 10 destroyers, 12 frigates, 83 corvettes, 63 submarines, more on those in a minute, 123 offshore patrol vessels, and 47 mine warfare vessels. By comparison, NATO has 2,689 total hulls, giving it a 6.5-time advantage over Russia. It's unclear what the total naval tonnage of NATO's fleet is, but with 17 aircraft carriers compared to Russia's 1, the advantage is likely to be significantly more pronounced. In addition, NATO has 13 helicopter carriers, while Russia has none, and 101 destroyers and 128 frigates, more than 10 times as many as Russia. Russia does have slightly more corvettes, 83 versus NATO's 69, but NATO again holds a significant advantage in the number of submarines, with 147. NATO also has 497 offshore patrol vessels and 180 mine warfare vessels, a roughly fourfold advantage in both cases. As it does in the air, NATO also holds a significant qualitative advantage at sea, although in this case, the differences are largely shaped by divergent strategic doctrines, technological capabilities, and geographic priorities. NATO's doctrine emphasizes power projection, interoperability among allies, and blue water operations across the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and beyond. Russia, on the other hand, focuses on regional dominance, asymmetric capabilities, and defense in depth, particularly in contested zones like the Baltic and Black Seas. Not that that's worked out well for them in the Black Sea, where Ukraine's drone warfare has forced what remains of the fleet to retreat from around Crimea further east along the Russian Black Sea coast. By contrast, NATO's qualitative edge lies in carrier strike groups, advanced anti-submarine warfare or ASW systems, and integrated command structures, whereas Russia compensates with potent submarine fleets, long-range anti-ship missiles, and coastal defense networks. In terms of potential for power projection, there's no comparison between the two. NATO's 17 aircraft carriers and 14 amphibious assault ships enable large-scale air and amphibious operations far from home waters. Russia operates just a single, aging Admiral Kuznetsov-class carrier with limited combat effectiveness and no amphibious carriers, underscoring its focus on protecting its coastlines rather than expeditionary warfare. In the meantime, one area where Russia does hold a qualitative advantage is in submarines, particularly in stealthy diesel-electric and nuclear-powered attack submarines like the Varshov-Yanka and Yesen class, optimized for ASW in confined seas. It's 12 ballistic missile submarines that ensure second-strike nuclear capability. NATO, while possessing more submarines overall, relies heavily on US Virginia and Ohio-class subs, with European allies contributing smaller, regionally focused fleets. However, NATO's integrated ASW networks, using maritime patrol aircraft, sonar arrays, and allied coordination, provide superior detection and response capabilities. Above the waves, NATO's surface fleet is more technologically advanced as well as larger. Many of its destroyers and frigates, for example, the USS Arleigh Burke class and Spanish F-100, are equipped with Aegis combat systems and long-range air defense, offering fleet protection, ballistic missile defense, and strike operations. Russia fields fewer but heavily armed surface vessels, such as the Admiral Gorshov-class frigates, armed with Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles and Caliber land attack cruise missiles, closing the gap in powerful strike potential despite smaller numbers. Moreover, NATO benefits from superior shipbuilding capacity, maintenance infrastructure, and R&D investment, the latter particularly evident in the US and UK. The alliance leads in unmanned systems, electronic warfare integration, and network-centric warfare. Russia, on the other hand, faces chronic delays in modernization and limited production capacity, but prioritizes asymmetric capabilities like hypersonic missiles and stealthy submarines to offset its numerical and structural disadvantages. On land, the comparison provides some surprising results. The equipment count is more even, and Russia even has a numerical advantage in some categories. Despite its massive losses in Ukraine, Russia maintains a fleet of over 131,000 military vehicles in total. That includes an estimated 5,750 tanks, 3,000 multiple launch rocket systems, or MLRS, and more than 13,000 pieces of artillery. NATO, for its part, has almost 11,500 tanks, twice as many as Russia, but a third fewer MLRS systems, at 1,977, and around 20% fewer artillery pieces at 10,279. Again, the numbers don't tell the whole story. NATO's land forces are characterized by a focus on high-intensity conventional combat, advanced technology, and interoperability among member states, which provides a significant qualitative edge in areas such as command and control, precision strike capabilities, and combined arms operations. The alliance also benefits from superior logistics, mobility, and the ability to rapidly reinforce forward-deployed forces through air, sea, and land routes, despite challenges posed by Russian anti-access, area denial, A2AD capabilities in regions like Kaliningrad. In contrast, Russia's land forces emphasize mobility, firepower, and the ability to conduct large-scale combined arms operations, particularly near its borders. While Russia has narrowed the qualitative gap with NATO in conventional capability since 2008 through military reforms and modernization, its forces still face significant challenges in training, morale, and logistical readiness. The Russian military's ability to conduct mass mobilization and sustain prolonged conflict is also considered limited, and Russia's combat effectiveness has been rightly questioned in Ukraine, although there are signs that the military is adapting to modern warfare, such as in the use of drones. Indeed, although Russia's many failures in Ukraine are well documented, the fact that huge numbers of its forces and the vast majority of its systems now have extensive combat experience potentially gives Russia a considerable edge. NATO's combat engagements have been limited following its withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 and Syria and Iraq more recently. There is one question remaining, perhaps the most pertinent. Has Russia's war in Ukraine terminally weakened its ability to wage war beyond Ukraine, for example, by invading the Baltic states, or is this just the start of an extended imperialist land grab? Opinions differ quite widely, with some experts feeling that Russia is a spent force whose collapse is just a matter of time, while many have been sounding the alarm that NATO should prepare itself for imminent war with a resurgent Russia in the next few years. Indeed, many seem to hold both views at the same time. The logical contradiction in this position is obvious. How can Russia be simultaneously collapsing and preparing to invade Europe? There's only one way this makes logical sense, and that's if NATO is in an even worse state than Russia. As you can see from the numbers we've presented so far, that's simply not true. So perhaps the truth is that neither of the original positions is true either, i.e., Russia is neither collapsing nor preparing to invade Europe. Russian President Vladimir Putin has long insisted that Russia has no intention of attacking or invading Europe, and that his actions in Ukraine are to prevent what he sees as an existential threat to Russia from NATO expanding right onto his doorstep in Ukraine. Of course, his invasion of Ukraine directly caused long neutral Finland to join NATO, effectively putting NATO on his northern border. But the position of Russia's long border with Ukraine and the long-standing enmities and complicated relations between the two nations undoubtedly make NATO in Ukraine a much more challenging prospect. For one thing, if the current estimate of Ukraine's armed forces of close to 900,000 is correct, the simple addition of Ukraine's forces to NATO's would increase NATO's advantage by roughly a quarter. Russia does have several advantages over NATO that Russia could exploit, while NATO is still building up its forces under the new rearmament plan. In particular, NATO's air defences against drone and missile attacks on its eastern front are a weak point, as has been exposed during the wave of drone incursions across Europe, the majority of which appear to have been launched from inside the territory of the affected countries. Many member states lack effective defences, and in some cases policy to combat these kinds of hybrid attacks effectively, let alone the kind of drone and missile swarms Ukraine has to deal with a few times a week. However, with the expedited construction of a drone wall taking place, helped by Ukraine's expertise in drone warfare, that gap is currently being filled. When it is, the only real advantage that Russia has left is temporary in hypersonic missiles, production of drones of all sizes, and Russia's new range of so-called nuclear superweapons like the Burevestnik, Aryeshnik, Poseidon, Avangard, and Sarmat systems. If these systems work as claimed, which is by no means certain at this point, they represent a qualitative advantage that NATO can't yet match. While comparable weapons are in development, Russia for now has a large and potentially critical head start. The thing is, with the exception of the Aryeshnik, these new Russian superweapons are all nuclear-capable weapons, and that's the scariest part of a potential confrontation between NATO and Russia. Given NATO's overwhelming superiority in conventional weapons, would Russia even attempt a conventional war, ground maneuvers, air raid, long-range missile strikes, etc.? Or would it escalate directly into nuclear strikes with its enormous nuclear arsenal, knowing that, as Admiral Radakin laid out, a conventional war would almost certainly lead to a devastating loss for Russia. Putin recently hinted at this prospect overtly. "We're not going to war with Europe. I've said that 100 times. But if Europe suddenly wants to fight us and starts, we're ready right now," Putin told reporters in Moscow ahead of peace talks with the US delegation. This statement was widely reported in the Western press, but they almost uniformly neglected to report on what he said next. "If Europe suddenly starts a war with us, I think it will end very quickly. This is not Ukraine. With Ukraine, we're acting with surgical precision, carefully. This is not a war in the direct modern sense of the word," he said, adding that if Europe does clash with Russia, Moscow will soon have no one to negotiate with. That's as clear a sign as any that if a conflict between NATO and Russia goes kinetic, Russia isn't intending to get bogged down in a conventional war. It's extremely unlikely to win. It's going to go nuclear and quickly. Let's hope we never have to find out for real whether Putin's bluffing about that. France likes to do things its own way. It plays by its own rules and charts its own path, refusing to blend in with the crowd or do what everyone else is doing. And nowhere is that more evident than in its military. The French armed forces have always been known for their unpredictable and somewhat unconventional actions, and that's still true to this day. Indeed, France's army today arguably makes zero sense in many ways. Yet, while that might seem like a weakness at first, it's actually one of the reasons why the French army is so effective and is fast becoming one of the most fearsome, formidable forces not just in Europe, but the entire world. Indeed, it's France's unpredictability and outright refusal to comply with the norms and standards of many of its NATO allies that make it such an interesting and unique member of the alliance. And we'll dive into some of the out-of-ordinary aspects of the French armed forces in this video, beginning with perhaps the strangest of them all, the French Foreign Legion. The Legion, as it's commonly referred to, is one of the world's only elite military units to be made up of people of numerous nationalities from all over the globe. To be more precise, recent statistics suggest that approximately 140 countries are represented in the Legion today, with some of the finest, best-trained soldiers from Europe, Africa, Asia, and beyond, all battling side by side for the flag of France. While some other nations also have units that employ non-natives and non-citizens, the French Foreign Legion is in a class of its own. It's the most active and high-profile example of a unit of this kind, and also ranks among the most efficient military units on Earth, with a long and storied track record of successful operations in locations like Chad, the Ivory Coast, Mali, Afghanistan, and beyond. And given its past successes and elite reputation, the Foreign Legion is often one, if not the first French ground unit to arrive in conflict zones and open fire along the front lines. It's the perfect option for Paris to deploy in situations that could be regarded as somewhat messy or difficult from a political perspective, and a vital cog of the French military machine. Few other nations worldwide can boast of their own elite corps of world-class operatives, ready, willing, and able to lay their lives on the line for a country they weren't born in. And while the Legion demonstrates France's ability and willingness to look beyond its borders for military strength and support, it also stands in stark contrast to much of the country's military doctrine, which largely revolves around domestic development and production and homegrown excellence. Indeed, while many other nations, including major military powers, will use a mixture of domestically designed equipment and other weapons, munitions, and vehicles sourced from other countries, Paris strives to use as much made-in-France gear as it possibly can. And it has no qualms about bucking trends and ignoring its allies' examples when it comes to which sorts of weapons, vehicles, and other assets it decides to prioritize. Take the Jaguar, for example. The EBRC Jaguar is a six-wheeled armored fighting vehicle designed and developed by three French companies: KNDS France, Arquus, formerly known as Renault Trucks Defense, and Thales. It was in development for over a decade before entering service in 2022, with a grand total of 300 of these vehicles set to roll out by 2035. Each one cost around €6 million or $7 million, and they fall into the category of medium armored reconnaissance vehicles, which is not a category of military vehicles that many other nations pay much attention to. Indeed, Many nations did away with these kinds of vehicles years ago, but France, ever the outlier, continues to make them one of its top priorities and intends to use vehicles like the Jaguar for both recon and screening missions in the coming years. Recon missions quite simply revolve around the vehicles being dispatched ahead of other units in order to scout out locations and look for enemy positions or assets, gathering intelligence to report back to command. Screening missions, meanwhile, involve specialized assets, like the Jaguar, being deployed either just ahead of or along the flanks of larger formations, with the objectives of providing early warning, protection, or even a distraction, keeping enemy forces busy, while the rest of the friendly force takes up a more strategic position to eliminate them. To carry out missions like these, the Jaguars need to be fast, powerful, and capable of taking a hit. Fortunately, that's exactly how France made them. Equipped with 500 horsepower militarized Volvo D11 six-cylinder turbo diesel engines, each Jaguar can reach a peak speed of 56 miles per hour, 90 kilometers per hour, making them much faster than the likes of tanks and many other armored vehicles, with an operational range of up to 500 miles, 800 kilometers, which is around 200 miles more than the average tank. One of the big reasons they're so fast and able to cover such big distances is because they're fitted with wheels, not tracks. That does put them at a slight disadvantage when it comes to off-road excursions, but France's commanders know that and will most likely avoid deploying the Jaguars in off-road environments unless absolutely necessary. Each Jaguar also comes complete with a 40 CTC, or 40mm case telescope armament system, designed to fire 40mm telescoped ammunition, along with 4 Acheron MP missiles, French-made fire-and-forget anti-tank guided missiles with a range of just over 3 miles or 5 kilometers. In addition to its primary armament, the Jaguar also comes complete with a T3 Hornet S remote-controlled weapon station and a 7.62mm machine gun, plus a Gallic self-protection system, capable of deploying 14 80mm smoke grenades to keep the vehicle safe when operating in dangerous locations. The Jaguar's super survivability also comes courtesy of its NATO standard STANAG 4569 Level 4 armor, with additional modular armor kits also available to provide extra protection as needed. All of this adds up to a vehicle that, while not a tank, certainly doesn't feel like a traditional infantry fighting vehicle or troop carrier either. The Jaguar is remarkably powerful and well protected, yet extraordinarily agile as well. It's a testament to France's consistent focus on producing and deploying wheeled vehicles that can get in and out of areas quickly and efficiently, while dealing plenty of damage to their enemies along the way. We've seen the benefits of this approach in action on numerous occasions in the past. During the Gulf War, for example, France deployed 12,500 of its personnel in the form of Division Daguet, which operated on the left flank of America's 18th Airborne Corps. Its objective was clear: capture the Al Salman Air Base, situated some 90 miles or 150 kilometers in Iraqi territory. The offensive began at 7 a.m. on February 24, 1991, and the airbase was captured the very next day. The French force also eliminated Iraq's 45th Mechanized Infantry Division, with only 2 French troops killed in combat and minor equipment losses. It was one of the most impressive operations of the entire war. While other coalition forces were still readying themselves for battle and planning their next steps over the days and weeks to follow, France sped ahead of everyone else, achieving its objectives in record time. And it was in large part thanks to the many rapid armored vehicles in its arsenal at the time, including VAB armored personnel carriers, AMX-10 RC wheeled fighting vehicles, and ERC-90 reconnaissance vehicles. The Jaguar is set to replace all 3 of those vehicles, bringing next-generation efficiency to a force that's already proven itself as one of the fastest and most effective on Earth. Medium armored vehicles like this aren't perfect. They have their flaws and their weaknesses. They stand to struggle in drone-heavy environments, for example, and drones are certainly a hot topic in the military world at the moment, due to Russia's enormous reliance on massive drone swarms and missile salvos to cause chaos across Ukraine. However, while unmanned aerial vehicles are set to become a bigger and more important part of warfare in years ahead, countries should not make the mistake of focusing so much on drones alone that they forget about other kinds of conflicts. That's especially true for France, which is the second most active fighting force in the NATO alliance after the United States and conducts a lot of its military operations in Africa. There, in countries like Mali, Syria, and Chad, French forces have amassed a wealth of experience carrying out counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency missions on countless occasions, with Paris repeatedly having to play peacekeeper in countries it once countered among its colonies. Those kinds of missions demand flexibility. They often involve dynamic, rapidly changing battlefield conditions and front lines that are anything but stable. In those kinds of environments, speed can often be the difference maker between victory and defeat. And while many forces would struggle to cover ground and get ahead of their enemy, France's focus on an agile and mobile ground force ensures that it's always one step ahead. During Operation Serval in Mali, for example, French forces were tasked with ousting Islamic militants that had launched a rebellion against the government and were marching towards the center of Mali from the country's northern regions. Once more, with the help of speedy recon vehicles like the AMX-10RC and ERC, the French army was able to cover thousands of miles of ground in a fraction of the time it would have taken many other ground forces, quite possibly preventing the entire collapse of the Malian government in the process. Given France's propensity for using armored vehicles that are more agile than average, one might assume that French tanks also boast bonus mobility compared to their international counterparts. But that's not the case. In yet another example of its unconventionality, France has made battle tanks that actually rank among the biggest and heaviest around, the Leclerc. Designed and developed during the 1980s and officially introduced into service in 1992 to replace the AMX-30, the Leclerc is, in many ways, the embodiment of everything that makes the French army so special, both good and bad. Around 860 of these tanks were built between 1990 and 2008, with approximately half of them shipped off to the United Arab Emirates, leaving France with around 406 units total according to the latest data, of which 222 are operational and 184 remain in storage. Each one measures up at over 32 feet, 9.87 meters in length, almost 12 feet, 3.6 meters in width, and over 8 feet, 2.53 meters tall, with enough space inside for a crew of 3, commander, gunner, and driver. Weight varies depending on the variant, but the heaviest Leclercs tip the scales at around 63 tons. These tanks are also exceptionally expensive, costing around 7.7 million euros or $9 million per unit. And when they were first made, during the Cold War era, they were in many ways groundbreaking. First of all, they were almost entirely French-made. That means that almost every component, from the tracks to the armor, and nearly everything in between, was made in France. That's very different to many other main battle tanks, which might feature an engine from one country, a chassis from another, a fire control system from somewhere else, and so on. The Leclerc's design was also exceptionally ambitious, with France wanting to break new ground in terms of tank accuracy, range, and firepower. To bring that dream to life, its teams developed the world's first fully digital fire control system, boasting automatic target tracking, superior thermal imaging than most other NATO tanks of the time, and an innovative though somewhat high-maintenance auto-loader too. Fitted with a CN120-26 or Model F1 smoothbore 120mm tank gun, a 12.7mm coaxial M2HB machine gun, and a 7.62mm machine gun, the Leclerc is certainly capable of packing a punch. And while it's not the fastest, the strongest, or the most advanced tank in the world, it served Paris's purposes perfectly over the years. It also provides the ideal foundation for France to build on, with plans to upgrade the existing Leclerc fleet into next-generation Leclerc XLRs, which will introduce an array of upgrades, including a remotely operated turret gun, additional modular armor packages, rear cage armor, and cutting-edge electronic networked architecture. The Leclerc represents France's independent, free-thinking approach to military matters. It's not perfect, but it does the job it was built to do, and like the Jaguar and other assets in the French arsenal, it gives Paris something a little different to work with, something unique and distinct compared to many of the other main battle tanks in operation across the NATO alliance. Because of that, France has more ways than most to catch its enemies by surprise, to defy their expectations and confuse their commanding officers. Many countries around the world use German Leopard 2 tanks, for example, or American M1 Abrams. So countries like Russia are constantly looking for ways to counter and destroy those specific sorts of tanks. Given that the Leclerc is only operated by France and the UAE, it's more of an unknown quantity and has the potential to perform much more impressively than its technical specifications might suggest. And while France may not lead the world in the tank department, it has produced some of the most impactful and innovative pieces of military hardware in other categories. Its Caesar self-propelled howitzer, for example, was a game-changer at the time of its launch and is still immensely relevant and valuable today, having been used by operators across Europe, Africa and Asia in conflicts like the Battle of Mosul, the Battle of Baghouz and the Russia-Ukraine War. A 155mm 52 caliber self-propelled gun, capable of firing 39 52 caliber NATO standard shells, the Caesar comes attached to either a 6x6 or 8x8 truck chassis for rapid repositioning and almost unparalleled mobility. Powered by an autonomous weapon network system, it's able to precisely strike targets as far as 25 miles or 40 kilometers away with the use of extended range, full-bore ERFB ammunition, but can even fire further if needed, using rocket-assisted or smart munitions to strike locations up to 34 miles or 55 kilometers away. And it's only thanks to France's inherently independent style of thinking that made the Caesar possible to begin with. While other countries were working on much heavier and far less mobile systems, France dared to be different. Its engineers dreamed big, envisioning a howitzer that could fire further and deploy faster than anything else in existence at the time. And they had the freedom to experiment with that idea, resulting in the Caesar, a shining example of France's speed and efficiency-oriented doctrine in action. It's down to that same doctrine, along with France's unshakable confidence and belief in doing things its own way, that has led to numerous other exciting innovations, from the French Rafale jets, which rank among the very best in the world, to its ongoing Scorpion program, which aims at modernizing the country's army like never before, not only introducing new vehicles like the aforementioned Jaguar and the Griffon, but also unifying its forces through a centralized information system that will enhance battlefield mobility, networking, and communication capabilities like never before, bringing yet more efficiency to an army renowned for its rapid responses. But beyond its speedy armored vehicles and supercharged self-propelled howitzers, perhaps the most important piece of the French military puzzle is its nuclear arsenal. With an estimated 219 nukes to its name, Paris possesses the world's fourth largest stock of nuclear warheads, but it uses them in quite a different fashion to nearly every other nuclear power on the planet in three distinct ways. Firstly, France isn't part of the NATO agreement, in which the alliance's nuclear nations, the US and the UK, share their warheads with other non-nuclear members, like Belgium, Germany and Italy. Instead, France retains complete control over its entire arsenal at all times. Second, unlike other big nuclear powers, France does not operate on the principle of mutually assured destruction, but instead follows a policy of strict sufficiency. In simple terms, what that means is while many countries have promised to only launch nuclear weapons if its enemy does so first, France has made no such pledges. Instead, it operates a strategically sized arsenal that's just big enough to effectively wipe out an enemy force, including Russia, which helps to keep its maintenance costs down while still making it a major threat, theoretically deterring anyone from invading its territory or threatening its sovereignty. Third, and perhaps most important of all, France reserves the right to fire nuclear warning shots at its enemies. In other words, if the country feels that it's sufficiently under threat, like if Russian forces were marching towards its borders, for example, it wouldn't simply wait to see what happened or rely on diplomacy and negotiations to work things out. It has the ability to fire a small, but still exceptionally dangerous tactical nuclear device to defend itself and deter its enemy from any further aggression. It's a truly unique system, like so many other elements of the French armed forces, and it could someday prove to be the most vital factor in keeping France safe from a future invasion. Because while other countries might dawdle, dally and hesitate, France has proven time and time again that it's more ready to fire first and ask questions later. This, combined with its commitment to domestic innovation, bold experimentation, and boundary-breaking engineering makes France by far one of the deadliest foes for any enemy in its way. The United Kingdom was once one of the world's strongest military superpowers, taking a leading role in both the First and Second World Wars. Then, it slowly started to slip away. Defence spending was slashed, assets were sold or scrapped, and once mighty branches of the British military, like the Royal Navy, lost their fear factor entirely. But that's all beginning to change. Britain is bouncing back in a massive way, set to become stronger than ever and reclaim its seat at the high table of military powers where it belongs. For many, the UK's military comeback is long overdue. This, after all, is a nation that once ruled over large parts of the world, with the British Empire ranking as by far the largest in recorded history, extending over 13.7 million square miles, 35.5 square million kilometers, or almost a quarter of the Earth's entire land area. It was even described as the empire on which the sun never sets, since the sun was always shining on at least one of its many territories, which extended across Asia, Africa, North America, and beyond. But as the 20th century progressed, everything changed. In the wake of the Second World War, the balance of power fell uncontrollably out of Britain's hands and into those of far larger nations like the United States and Soviet Union. Britain, meanwhile, was essentially bankrupt, and with anti-colonial sentiments stirring in its many territories across the globe, its empire began to disintegrate bit by bit. By 1965, the number of people under British rule had slipped from 700 million in 1945 to just 5 million. Not only was Britain's influence and reach reducing, but funding for its military forces was also declining. And when the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War came to its end in 1989, the UK endured an even bigger drop-off. Like many other nations of Western Europe at the time, Britain felt that the prospects of another major ground war breaking out across the continent were suddenly much lower than they had been in years. The world seemed largely at peace, and the UK in particular, thanks to its island location, was unlikely to suffer any sort of full-scale invasion or attack. So why should it waste money on maintaining a massive military force? Throughout the 1990s, the country's defence budget faced one cut after another. It fell by 6% in 1992, another 4% in 1993, 5% more in 1994, a whopping 7% in 1995, 2% the year after, and yet another 7% in 1997. Defence spending as a proportion of GDP dropped from 4.1% at the start of the decade to just 2.4% by its end, and the effects were felt far and wide throughout all branches of the British military, in what then Defence Secretary Tom King called the biggest cut in real terms that the country had seen in years. The British Army, for example, saw its numbers of active duty personnel decline to around 116,000, which was the lowest it had been since the 1800s. And many historic regiments were either cut or disbanded entirely. The British Army of the Rhine, for instance, saw its numbers drop from around 55,000 troops to just 25,000 by the late 1990s. The Royal Air Force, RAF, experienced similar reductions in scope and influence. Tornado fighter squadrons shrank, and the entire RAF fleet eventually slipped to just a third of the size that it was prior to the Cold War's end. Several aircraft were also put into early retirement, like the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, which had been one of the top jets in the RAF's arsenal since the late 1960s. In the Royal Navy, the impact was arguably even larger. Numerous major and auxiliary parts of the force's fleet were reduced, with Britain's total tally of destroyers and frigates slipping from around 50 to just 31 by 2003, with only 26 of them deemed operational. Mine countermeasure forces were also slashed in size, and several of the country's submarines were also removed from service. Research and development also felt the full force of Britain's military decline, with numerous projects either shelved or cancelled altogether. The Nimrod AEW-3, for example, was a proposed airborne early warning AEW aircraft that was intended to provide the UK with airborne radar cover. It was scrapped in the late 80s. Planned avionics upgrades to aircraft like the Tornado were also scaled back, and Britain also pulled out of the European NFR-90 frigate programme, which was set to create a new frigate for use across NATO nations. As a result, the remaining forces that were left over were placed under additional stress due to reduced resources and manpower, while maintenance and training budgets also saw cuts, minimizing Britain's military capabilities even further. Many of those capability gaps persisted for years to follow, and the country that had once ruled much of the known world became a shadow of its former self. As the years passed, the situation only worsened. Successive governments continued to cut defense spending, seeing the military as more of a side note or distraction than any sort of priority. Dozens of military bases closed, and even modest recruitment targets failed to be achieved as the 21st century continued, while assets continued to be scrapped or sold off and squadrons disbanded. And even when British forces were deployed around the world, they often did so with outdated equipment and a fraction of the fleets and assets they once had. All of a sudden, the UK had become a minor player on the global military stage, and even its closest allies like the United States had to stop and ask the question, would Britain ever be a relevant military force again? By 2016, the country's defence budget slipped below 2% of GDP, and it continued to decline in the 2 years after that. Resources were stretched increasingly thin, and the days of Britain as a military superpower appear to have been confined to the history books. Then, things started to change. Not openly, but in secret, behind closed doors and in underground test sites. Britain began to plan for a whole new era of warfare, exploring exciting and innovative new ways to bring its military back from the depths of despair and into the 21st century at last. And this would be a revolution built on quality, not quantity. The UK had no plans to suddenly launch major recruitment drives or set lofty goals to triple the size of its army or tank fleet. Instead, it wanted to rewrite the rules of engagement, developing bold new assets and world-leading technologies to bring back Britain's edge, to re-establish its position at the forefront of the military world. Thus, huge teams of scientists, coders and engineers got to work on a new project. A project that would symbolise Britain's military rebirth and return to its rightful place, a world-leading 6th-generation fighter jet that would soon become the envy of the entire world. The Tempest. Conceptual work on this jet began in 2015, but the official Tempest program wasn't officially unveiled until 2018, and Britain hopes to roll this game-changing jet out by 2035. Manufactured by BAE Systems for both the Royal Air Force and the Italian Air Force, with the help of Rolls-Royce, the British Ministry of Defence and Leonardo, an Italian aerospace and defence company, the Tempest is set to be one of the most advanced jets ever made. Boasting a modular design that will allow it to take on a variety of roles and achieve almost any aerial objective imaginable, the Tempest features delta wings and vertical stabilizers, combined with cutting-edge stealth technology and even the ability to fly unmanned. Its design also incorporates artificial intelligence deep learning, along with a radar warning receiver that's said to be 4 times more accurate and 90% smaller than existing units, plus swarming technology to control drones and even directed energy weapons like lasers to deal massive damage with pinpoint precision. Smarter, faster, and infinitely more advanced than any jet the UK has made in the past, the Tempest is the standard bearer of Britain's military comeback, with some of the world's best and brightest teams working to ensure that this project comes to fruition by the scheduled deadline. And when that happens, like a mighty phoenix rising from the ashes, Britain's Royal Air Force will rule the skies once again. But the UK isn't just intent on bringing back the glory days of its aerial forces. It wants to revolutionise and redefine every single branch of its military, with projects in place for both the Navy and Army as well. Bit by bit, the Royal Navy has slowly started to reverse its decline, with 2 new frigates set to join its fleet in the years ahead, the Type 26 and the Type 31. The Type 26, or City-class frigate, is a successor to the Type 23, which was introduced in the late 80s, designed for anti-submarine warfare missions, but also capable of air defence support and general-purpose operations. The Type 26 will be shared between the UK, Canada and Australia, but Britain has spearheaded the charge of its design and development. In the same way that the Tempest is set to rewrite the rules of aerial engagement, the Type 26 brings game-changing tools and technologies to the seas, with advanced sonar systems, vertical missile launchers, modular weapon bays, state-of-the-art decoys, and other exceptional innovations. The Type 31 goes even further, costing in excess of £300 million or $396 million per unit, and powered by world-leading Rolls-Royce diesel engines and generators. This Inspiration-class ship is set to excel in every area, from speed and maneuverability to endurance, technology, situational awareness, electronic warfare, and firepower. Together, these two frigates embody a whole new era for the Royal Navy, one in which Britain will no longer be playing catch-up with the rest of the world, but will instead lead the way with its own domestic ships serving as shining examples for other military forces to follow and learn from. On the ground, meanwhile, Britain is now closer than ever to officially introducing its next-generation main battle tank, the Challenger 3, a successor to the long-running Challenger 2, which has been in service since 1998. The Challenger 3 brings numerous new additions to the table, most notably its transition from the 120mm L30A1 rifled main gun of the previous model to the significantly stronger 120mm L55A1 smoothbore gun, bringing British tank technology in line with other NATO nations. The Challenger 3 also comes complete with a stronger hull and an all-new turret, opening up new offensive and defensive capabilities. Capable of firing the latest kinetic energy armor-piercing rounds, as well as programmable airbursts and multi-purpose ammunition, the Challenger 3 will be more lethal, versatile, and effective than any tank Britain has fielded in the past. It also boasts improved survivability thanks to active protection system, APS technology, and tougher armor, combined with a completely modernized fire control and sensor suite light years beyond anything seen in the Challenger 2. And Britain isn't stopping there. It's not merely bolstering its military branches with all new assets, but also pushing the very boundaries of military innovation, creating futuristic, almost science fiction style systems that many thought to be impossible. Systems like Dragonfire. Imagine a laser capable of firing with such intensity and precision that it can bring drones and missiles spiraling from the sky in the blink of an eye, at a tiny fraction of the cost of interceptor missiles and other air defenses. It sounds too good to be true, but Britain made it possible. In 2024, its Defence Ministry announced successful tests of the Dragonfire system, revealing the extraordinary efficiency and accuracy of this next-level system. Dragonfire exploits UK technology to be able to deliver high-power laser over long ranges. The precision required is equivalent to hitting a £1 coin from a kilometre away. Laser-directed energy weapons can engage targets at the speed of light and use an intense beam of light to cut through the target, leading to structural failure or more impactful results if the warhead is targeted. Firing it for 10 seconds is the cost equivalent of using a regular heater for just an hour. Therefore, it has the potential to be a long-term, low-cost alternative to certain tasks missiles currently carry out. The cost of operating the laser is typically less than £10, $13 per shot. With innovations like this, Britain isn't merely catching up with other major military nations, it's surpassing them. It's redefining what warfare is, leading the way into an entirely new era of lasers and directed energy weaponry. At the same time, the UK knows that it's no longer an imperial force. It's a country 40 times smaller than the United States, and while it still has the 6th strongest economy on the planet, it doesn't have the vast global reach and resources it once did. In today's world, no country can cope alone, and today's Britain understands the enormous importance of strong and stable military alliances. That's why in 2021, it joined the AUKUS partnership with the United States and Australia, forming one prong of a powerful trident of military strength and intelligence. One of the big benefits of being in this alliance is that the UK will be able to benefit from American nuclear submarine technology to build a new next-generation sub that will help its Royal Navy become even stronger and project power far and wide across the world. It also strengthens ties with two important allies, while serving as a symbolic reminder of Britain's re-emergence onto the military stage. Recent years have also seen Britain set up a major military base, Camp Viking, in Norway, giving the country a strong military presence along NATO's northern frontier, as well as signing new defence deals with Japan and establishing rotational presences in strategic locations around the globe. Bit by bit, Britain has transformed from near irrelevance into one of the most active, visible, and innovative forces on the planet. And it's not slowing down anytime soon. Recent years have seen defence spending start to rise once more, with the UK setting ambitious but achievable goals of over 4% GDP defence spending by 2027 and 5% by 2035. The country also established a brand new defence and intelligence agency, the National Cyber Force, NCF, intended to ensure that the UK is ready to defend against cyber attacks and digital espionage, as well as being able to deploy virtual attacks of its own, bringing Britain well and truly into the modern age, where hacking and cyber warfare play increasingly important and powerful roles both on the battlefield and beyond. On top of all of this, Britain continues to hold two important aces up its sleeve. The first is the Special Air Service, or SAS, long regarded as one of the strongest special forces units on the planet. While few details are revealed regarding their numbers, assets, or operations, the SAS has proven itself to be among the most fearsome and effective forces ever assembled, carrying out missions around the world, eliminating terrorists, saving hostages, and preventing catastrophes. Even as Britain's major military branches declined in size and power, the SAS remained one of the Western world's most lethal assets. The second and perhaps largest of all of the UK's advantages is the fact that it's one of the 9 nuclear powers in existence today. And while it may not have the biggest arsenal of nuclear weapons, with an estimated 225 warheads in total, it may soon have one of, if not the best deterrent systems on Earth, the Dreadnought-class submarine. Set to replace the Vanguard class in the early 2030s, the Dreadnought is a next-generation ballistic missile submarine like no other, breaching the boundaries of stealth and survivability, and powered by groundbreaking technologies like quantum navigation and AI decision systems. These new subs have the power to operate almost invisibly, remaining utterly undetectable for months at a time, and ensuring that Britain will continue to operate an ongoing at-sea deterrent for decades to come. So, whether it's on the surface of the seas or down in their murky depths, on land, in the air, in cyberspace, or in the shadows, Britain is raising the bar, setting a new standard of excellence, upgrading and evolving its capacities in every possible field of operations, leaving no stone unturned and no weakness unaddressed. And it's committed to keep on striving for continuous improvement in the years to come, especially with the rising threat of Russian aggression. Indeed, in June 2025, the UK government announced even more ambitious plans for the coming years. The army will deliver a tenfold increase in lethality over the next 10 years by harnessing firepower, surveillance technology, autonomy, digital connectivity, and data, leading the way in NATO in its use of technology to change how it fights, improving speed and accuracy. The government's report went on to note that the Royal Navy will ramp up work and production of new drone systems to adapt to changing warfare conditions, with at least 10% of the Ministry of Defence budget set to be spent on drones and novel technologies. This shows that Britain has been paying close attention to events in Ukraine and is learning the lessons of that war, preparing itself for future conflicts in which drone swarms are likely to play increasing important roles. The report also spoke of the UK taking a leading role in the NATO alliance, with strengthened nuclear, new tech, and updated conventional capabilities, before going on to discuss new hybrid fleet plans for the Royal Navy and numerous other exciting additions for the remainder of the 2020s and beyond. This is no longer the meek, background Britain the world saw throughout the 1990s and into the 21st century, an increasingly fractured and disparate force lacking the fire and strength that once made it great. Nor is it the imperial force of past eras, relying on its sprawling web of resources to project power worldwide. This is a new Britain, cutting edge, forward-thinking, hyper-connected, ready for whatever its enemies have to throw its way, and not just gaining ground on its closest allies, but moving ahead of them in terms of preparedness, technology, and the rapidity of its responses. Ukraine is not Russia's only target. It's clear that the Kremlin has its sights set on several other nations across Central and Eastern Europe, and Poland may very well be its top priority. Warsaw has been readying its defences for just such an occasion for quite some time, modernising its military, and increasing investment in its national security. But is Poland truly ready for a Russian invasion? Will the Kremlin's war machine roll all the way to Warsaw without a scratch, or would it come unstuck all over again, just as it has in Ukraine? So here's a closer look at how a hypothetical war between Russia and Poland in 2026 may play out. Of course, it's impossible to predict with any degree of certainty or precision how a military conflict could unravel. There are so many factors and variables at play, and near endless possibilities to explore and imagine. But we can look at the data and statistics available to make some educated assumptions about both sides' chances of victory. And if we focus purely and simply on core military metrics, like available manpower or quantities of tanks, bombers, fighter jets, and missile systems, it doesn't look great for Poland's prospects. According to the latest available data from Global Firepower, one of the world's leading sources of military data and analysis, which produces annual rankings of 145 modern military powers around the world, Russia has the joint second strongest armed forces on the planet, behind the United States in top spot and tied with China. Poland, meanwhile, fails to break the top 20, sitting in the 21st position, just ahead of Taiwan and Vietnam, but behind Ukraine, Egypt, and Australia. Digging deeper into the data, given that Russia is a much larger country than Poland, with a greater population, bigger stockpiles of military equipment, and an enormous military budget, it's unsurprising that the Kremlin comes out on top in most major metrics. In terms of manpower, for example, Russia may have suffered more than 1 million casualties in its war with Ukraine, but it still has an estimated 1.3 million active duty personnel, with 2 million more reservists ready to enter the fray, should they be needed. Russia also has more than 1 million more people reaching military age each year, along with a total population of more than 140 million people, with over 46 million deemed fit for active service. Poland, meanwhile, has a significantly smaller force of just over 200,000 people at the latest count, with a further 350,000 in reserve. Close to 500,000 Polish people reach military age each year, and the country's total population sits at over 38 million, with more than 15 million fit for service. However, Poland is taking steps to expand its active duty numbers. Early in 2025, the country's Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, announced a plan to make all Polish men undergo military training, as well as any women that wanted to play their part. He also unveiled a goal to grow the country's army to 500,000 active duty personnel, including reservists, and with millions more Polish men set to undergo military training, Poland would have countless more potential soldiers to call on should an invasion ever occur. It's still not enough to match Russia, man for man, but Poland is clearly doing what it can to build a force of significant size and strength. Soldiers are the lifeblood of any army, but a strong military force also requires large numbers of powerful advanced equipment, weapons, and vehicles. On the ground, at least as far as statistics are concerned, Russia has historically had one of the strongest armies in the world. While it suffered enormous losses of tanks, armored vehicles, and other assets in Ukraine, it continues to boast of a force that dwarfs many other armies in the world. Russia has thousands more tanks than Poland, for example, and tens of thousands more armored vehicles. It also boasts dramatically greater numbers of self-propelled and towed artillery systems, with which it can bombard its enemies from a distance, and thousands of mobile rocket projectors, while Poland has just under 200. In the air too, Russia has a formidable force, with a grand total of over 4,000 aircraft. Its fleet is comprised of more than 800 fighter jets, hundreds of transport craft, over 1,600 helicopters, and more than 550 attack helicopters. The Polish Air Force is a fraction of the size, with less than 500 aircraft in total, including a few dozen fighter jets and just over 200 helicopters. If a war were to break out between Poland and Russia, it's likely that much of the fighting would take place on land and in the air, rather than at sea. However, Russian forces could also deploy Baltic Fleet vessels from ports in St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad to strike at Poland's northern coast. On the water too, Russia has the numbers to deal significant damage. It has one of the largest navies in the world, with over 400 vessels, plus over 60 submarines, more than 80 corvettes, dozens of patrol vessels, and various frigates and destroyers. Despite investing heavily in other areas of its military, Poland has never had a particularly large navy. It has around 60 vessels overall, but lacks any destroyers or major warships that could rival those under the Kremlin's control. So, if we look only at which side has the larger army and bigger amounts of tanks, jets, and so on, Russia is and always will be the obvious winner against Poland and most other countries on Earth. It's a vast nation with the finances and resources necessary to amass a truly colossal force, and even as its economy suffers and its losses continue to amount along the front lines of Kyiv, it remains a military superpower with a kind of firepower that many other countries can only dream of. But as Russia's conflict with Ukraine shows, war is not just a numbers game. It's not necessarily a case of whichever side has the bigger force will inevitably win, and history is littered with examples of smaller militaries overcoming the odds and scoring big wins against much larger opponents. And once we start to look beyond the numbers, examining each of these two military forces more closely, it's clear to see that it's a much more even fight than it may first appear. For starters, we can't underestimate the impact of the Ukraine war on the Russian army. If the Kremlin gave the order to invade Poland in 2026, that would come after 4 whole years of grinding attritional and costly warfare with Kyiv. During that time, Russia hasn't simply suffered major losses, it's also become a significantly weaker force in more ways than one. Many of its strongest soldiers, for example, were those who led the charge when Vladimir Putin ordered the initial invasion in 2022. Since that date, so many of those soldiers, men who often dedicated their whole lives to the military and were more than willing than most to lay their lives on the line for Mother Russia, have either been wounded or perished on the battlefield. Of course, the Kremlin has plenty more people to call up and send into the meat grinder, and it always has the option to mobilize hundreds of thousands, if not millions of additional soldiers, should the need arise. But there's no doubt that the standard of its recruits has slipped over time. These days, those signing up to fight in regions like Donetsk and Luhansk aren't hardened soldiers with decades of experience or highly trained and motivated men in peak physical fitness. More often than not, recruits added to Russia's ranks lack training and drive, since the professional young officer corps that once strengthened the army's ranks has gradually been gutted as the war raged on. Russia also lacks non-commissioned officers, leaving nothing but an array of weakened veterans, fresh-faced recruits, black male minorities, and even convicts, as well as people with chronic illnesses, all dispatched to the front lines to fend off against a better trained and more smartly organized opponent. That's the story in Ukraine, and would also be a similar situation in Poland, where Russia's motley crew of poorly trained soldiers will come up against a smaller but more solid force, because Poland hasn't been playing around. In the years since Russia invaded Ukraine, Warsaw has taken the necessary steps to prepare itself for combat. Investing in depth, it's made smart, sensible moves to strengthen its forces, like the aforementioned plan to train countless more military-age men across the country, ensuring that there are so many more people who at least know how to handle a rifle and what to do if and when war breaks out. Poland also benefits from its 40,000-strong volunteer reserve, the Territorial Defense Force, as well as stay-behind forces across its many regions, with highly motivated and properly trained people ready to guard their land from an invading army. Several years of war with Ukraine have also taken their toll on Russia's vast stockpiles of military hardware, forcing the Kremlin's commanders to adopt increasingly desperate measures. Russian forces have been seen dragging rusty old tanks out of Soviet-era storage facilities, including T-62s, which were first produced back in 1961, and even older T-55s, which date back to the late 1940s. Of course, more modern Russian tanks do exist, like the T-90M, but due to economic hardships incurred during the war, combined with overwhelmed infrastructure, Russia lacks the facilities to produce these types of tanks in any significant numbers, and is currently trying to find ways to ramp up production regardless. So, even though it may have many more tanks to call on for an invasion of Poland, it's all a question of quality versus quantity. Russia certainly has the quantity, but as far as quality goes, its armor is distinctly lackluster. Any theoretical Kremlin charge on Warsaw would involve tanks that have fatal design flaws and were simply not designed with modern 21st century combat in mind. Many lack the state-of-the-art optics and battlefield management systems of today's top tanks, for example, putting them at a serious disadvantage against more advanced counterparts. As far as artillery goes, it's a similar situation. Russia has huge numbers of artillery systems, but will certainly struggle to make the most of them in Poland. The invasion of Ukraine has led to large-scale ammunition shortages, and many of Russia's best systems have either been damaged or destroyed in counter-battery duels or through Ukrainian precision drone strikes. So, while the Kremlin may once have been able to overwhelm almost any opponent with the sheer volume and scale of its artillery assaults, that simply is no longer the case. Meanwhile, on the Polish side, recent years have seen Warsaw take multiple measures to dramatically modernize its military and bolster its defensive and offensive capabilities. While other nations across Europe dawdled, Poland showed zero hesitation in upping its defense budget and making the changes it needed to make to get ready for a war with Russia. In 2022, it spent 2.7% of its GDP on defense. By 2024, that had risen to 4.2%. By 2025, it was even higher at 4.7%, placing Poland top of the list in terms of NATO nation defense spending in relation to GDP. And Poland's investments certainly aren't going to waste. The country's military leaders have kept a close eye on events in Ukraine and demonstrated exceptional intelligence and tactical planning in terms of how they allocate their funds. They've invested in a multitude of truly high-end assets that don't just enhance Poland's power projection, but should also make any future defense of the country much more viable and effective, even against a significantly larger force like Russia's. Some of its most impressive buys have been made in the tank department. Poland has purchased a large quantity of K2 Black Panther tanks from South Korea, for example, which are widely regarded as the most technologically advanced tanks of today, with the kind of internal electronics that put Russia's relics to shame. Warsaw has also invested in a total of 366 Abrams tanks from the US, 250 modern M1A2 SEP V3s, and 116 M1A1s, arguably among the toughest tanks in the world. Their all-round excellence makes them a near flawless fit for almost any kind of combat situation imaginable. On top of that, it's also bought some of Germany's Leopard 2PL tanks too, which also rank highly in terms of firepower, mobility, and protection. In short, Poland has assembled an all-star tank team, picking and choosing some of the finest models from around the world, and by 2030, it hopes to field more than 950 main battle tanks in total, including 360 K2s, 366 Abrams, including 250 M1A2 SEP V3, and 116 M1A1 Abrams tanks, and 235 Leopard 2s. These units are backed up by similar state-of-the-art infantry fighting vehicles like Rosomax, along with self-propelled howitzers and South Korea-supplied K9 Thunder artillery systems, giving Poland more than enough firepower to go toe-to-toe with Russia's extensive armor. Thanks to that, any ground battles between the two forces would be intensely competitive, and Poland would have the unique benefits of more modern equipment coupled with home field advantage, which could lead to multiple major victories in border regions and elsewhere. In the air too, Poland's forces are much more capable and lethal today than they were only a handful of years ago. The country's Air Force fields F-16 fighter jets and has ordered a batch of F-35s as well, which will guard the country's skies alongside South Korean FA-50 light fighters. On the ground, an increasingly complex multi-layered air defense system has also been established, with core components including American Patriot batteries and CAMM interceptor missile systems, reinforced with vast radar networks, providing all-important intelligence about target type, direction, speed, and location. So, even if Russia relied on similar tactics as it has in Ukraine, using vast drone swarms and massive missile salvos to strike at important locations across Poland's territory, Warsaw would be more than ready to counterattack those attacks, sending Russia's cheap Shahed drones and even its high-speed ballistic missiles spiraling out of the sky. Poland has also bolstered its border defenses like never before, thanks to the East Shield initiative, which launched in 2024. One of the most significant investments in border defense in Poland's entire history, East Shield will have cost around $2.55 billion once all the necessary work is complete. It involves a mixture of physical barriers like anti-tank ditches, bunkers, and fortifications, as well as surveillance and electronic warfare systems like AI-powered data centers, anti-drone networks, and radar towers scanning the surrounding environment around the clock, delivering invaluable intelligence and instant alerts regarding any incoming threats or suspicious activities. All in all, Poland has done everything in its power to make any attempted invasion of its territory a logistical nightmare for its enemies. Here's a closer look at how exactly that nightmare might play out. First, Russia would likely rely on an opening salvo of missiles and drones fired towards key targets close to the Polish border. They'd inevitably attempt to break through the East Shield, aiming at important infrastructure targets like radar towers, command nodes, and air defense installations. In turn, Poland's flawlessly prepared defenses would activate. The country has been anticipating an attack like this for years, practicing and perfecting its response to a prospective Russian aerial assault. Its layered defenses, like IMMINENT interceptors and Patriot batteries, would wipe most if not all Russian assets out of the air, with F-16s and other fighter squadrons scrambled to take out any remaining stragglers. Down on the ground, Russia might also attempt similar incursion targets to those it used at the outset of the Ukraine war, rolling in large numbers of troops, tanks and armoured vehicles, backed by artillery and bombing runs. Even in its existing unfinished state, the East Shield would prove more than a match for Russia's convoys, funneling enemy vehicles down predefined routes where Polish artillery would be waiting for them. Warsaw's Territorial Defence Force would also enter the fray, carrying out ambush and sabotage missions to catch the enemy unaware, while mechanized brigades, manning some of the world's strongest and most advanced tanks, would initiate counter-operations, striking at exposed Russian flanks and wiping isolated units off the map. Poland could also begin offensive operations of its own, as it would already undoubtedly have identified important Russian targets like ammo stockpiles and logistics hubs across Belarus and Kaliningrad. But Poland's biggest weapon isn't a tank, missile system or border defense. It's NATO. That's the game changer. That's the factor that would ensure that any Russian invasion of Poland would have zero chance of succeeding. Because unlike Ukraine, which is not a member of either the EU or NATO and has to rely on negotiation, bartering and so on to gain support from Western allies, Poland is part of both of those powerful alliances. As soon as any Russian force crosses the border or launches an attack on Polish soil, NATO's Article 5 triggers, and all other countries in the alliance will come to Warsaw's aid. That includes the world's strongest military force, the United States, along with numerous other major military players like France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Even without their help, Poland would more than likely be able to hold its ground and dismantle Russia's invading force. But with the full backing of NATO's intelligence, manpower, logistics and weapon systems, it will be utterly unstoppable, leaving Russia with only two real options: either retreat or escalate the situation to unprecedented levels, like a nuclear missile attack, as the Kremlin boasts the world's biggest stockpile of nuclear warheads. But NATO too includes several of the world's other nuclear powers, and even Putin almost definitely wouldn't want to walk the path of mutually assured destruction. So when all is said and done, there's absolutely zero chance that a Russian invasion of Poland would prove successful for the Kremlin. Not only is Poland better armed and equipped than ever before, but it has the full, unrivaled support of the world's strongest alliance behind it.
Tick-tock. That's the sound that's ringing through Germany's military high command as the country believes that a fight is coming soon. The fight will be huge. It will encompass all of NATO, and it will see the allies in Europe battle against the terrible enemy who has been trying to lay waste to Ukraine for almost 4 years, Russia. The clock is ticking and it's time to prepare for a battle that has gone from possible to imminent. In a shocking warning, one of Germany's leading generals has claimed that Russia could be preparing to launch a direct attack on a NATO member within the next 2 to 3 years. That general is Gerald Funke, who painted a picture of what this scenario might look like during a January 26th discussion with The Times. It's a scenario that makes for bleak reading. From the moment that Russia launches its assault against NATO, Germany finds itself in the thick of the action. However, it is the Germany of today, not the Germany that has spent the last few years preparing for this very scenario. Still, the country mobilizes. The 4,800-strong mechanized infantry brigade that Germany has stationed in Lithuania strikes back against the enemy, working alongside their NATO allies in the Baltic states. Their job is simply to hold on, to slow down the Russian advance until a rapid response team of 15,000 soldiers arrives at the front. That arrival would take a matter of days, but it would take several more weeks for tens of thousands of Allied soldiers all traveling through Germany to reach the front. Those soldiers will arrive via Germany's North Sea ports, and they will be then shuttled toward the Baltic states along roads and railways that have already been affected by Russian sabotage and hybrid warfare. With Russia actively on the attack, missile and drone strikes will also be a concern, meaning that some of the soldiers being transported might never make it to the front. Then, the horrifying part begins. Hundreds of casualties start being ferried back from the front, all into a German hospital system that is in no way prepared to handle the scale of death and injury that it's seeing. Germany would be plunged back into the darkest days of the COVID-19 pandemic. But that's the price to be paid for serving as NATO's logistical hub in Europe. Allies would arrive to offer support, of course, but as it stands now, Funke seems to be warning, NATO still has a long way to go before it's ready for the type of warfare that Putin wages. Funke has a plan, and Germany is trying to prepare itself for what it increasingly sees as an inevitable battle. But we'll get to that later in the video. This idea of a NATO war with Russia being closer than we might think has been discussed before. Funke's estimate of 2 to 3 years appears to be an echoing of the words of the German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius. Back in November, Pistorius outlined what he believes is the timescale of the impending Russian assault, and he made it clear that time is running out to get ready. We always said this could happen in 2029, but now there are analysts who believe that an attack is possible as early as 2028, and some military historians are even declaring last summer the last peaceful one, Pistorius claimed. New Sky reports that the German defense minister's claims were backed by intelligence assessments, specifically related to how Russia is attempting to rebuild its arsenal even as it wages war against Ukraine. Oxford Analytica has also spoken about this rebuilding, framing it in the context of a ceasefire or peace agreement with Ukraine. The outlet claims that Russia might see an increase in its arms exports as past clients start buying drones, along with the missiles and electronic warfare systems that have proven themselves effective in Ukraine. Money would flow in and Russia's defense manufacturing sector would go into overdrive, especially if the end of the Ukraine war, temporary or otherwise, is accompanied by a lifting of sanctions. Russia would simply be getting ready, and then it would strike again. Funke says there are already signs that Russia is getting ready for a much bigger fight than the one that it's taken on in Ukraine. What worries me at the moment is the hybrid side, the covert side. Sabotage, sleeper cells, some kind of targeted attacks. I can't rule out the use of long-range missiles, but I think the hybrid threat is very high, Funke tells The Times. Indeed, Russia's hybrid threat against Europe has been ramping up since Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine. New Eastern Europe says that this hybrid war actually started long before. As far back as 2014, which is the year that Russia launched a campaign of aggression against Ukraine that led to the annexation of Crimea, the Kremlin has been employing a multi-layered hybrid strategy against the West. Subversion and sabotage have become Russia's tools of the trade. Cyber attacks have targeted some of Europe's largest companies and governments. And, according to New Eastern Europe, Russia has spent well over a decade employing a campaign of disinformation designed to weaken the democratic institutions that stand in the way of Putin getting what he wants. Documented attacks increased fourfold between 2022 and 23, and threefold in 2024 compared to 23, the outlet reports. And it's not like 2025 has seen Russia de-escalate its hybrid warfare amidst peace talks with Ukraine. If anything, it's been getting worse. Russia is actively engaged in a shadow war with the West, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, said back in March. The main directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation has been actively recruiting what CSIS dubs local assets to carry out sabotage and subversion missions that Russian agents can't or won't carry out themselves. Of these attacks, which occurred during the period that New Eastern Europe documented, 27% have targeted transportation infrastructure. The same percentage of targeted government facilities, including military bases and even individual officials. As for the other 42%, those attacks are divided evenly between infrastructure targets and European industry. The scale of these hybrid assaults has already led Europe down a path that it once thought unthinkable: actual, tangible retaliation. By November, Politico was reporting that several European countries were looking at some form of retaliation. Troops marching toward Moscow were never an option. The surprise military drills and delivering a little hybrid warfare of their own through cyber operations were up for discussion in several of NATO's European member states. Cynics will argue that this was Europe being Europe, a lot of talk but very little in the way of action. However, though the gears of the European NATO machine may move slowly, they have at least started moving. The question now is, are they moving fast enough to ensure that NATO, Europe, and Germany are ready for what Funke says is coming? But before we answer that question, this is a quick reminder that you're watching The Military Show. Subscribe now for daily videos covering the latest military news in the US and Europe. But back to the question at hand, what NATO now needs is a plan. And as we said earlier in the video, Funke happens to have one, though he has also highlighted a handful of reservations and barriers that we're going to cover along the way. Funke knows that Germany's primary role in a war between NATO and Russia will be to serve as a logistical hub for all of the allies that need to shuttle soldiers and equipment through Central Europe and onto the Eastern Front. It's important for us to maintain Germany as a logistics hub and manage the supply lines for as long as possible, as smoothly as possible, meaning that if one route fails, we will have the option of using others instead, Funke tells The Times. This is vital when the front line of what you might call the new Cold War no longer runs down the center of Germany. It's almost 1,000 miles to Germany's east and could potentially run across Finland, the Baltic states, and thanks to the position of the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, Poland. Setting up appropriate logistics is easier said than done. As Le Monde reported in November, the question of European military mobility has long been overlooked, and that is a serious problem. Investments have been delayed and hurdles have been put in place when it comes to NATO's European members developing themselves into a collective fighting force that could run through Germany. And let's face it, Europe has also been dependent on the US to back up its military might. Moving tanks in particular could be a problem, as Le Monde points out when discussing a 2022 attempt to transport Leclerc tanks to Romania via road. These tanks had a reason to be heading into Romania. They were coming from France to strengthen a French deployment on its NATO allies' territory. However, strict limitations on the weight of vehicles in Germany prevented the tanks from heading to their destination via the roads, which forced a delay, as the tanks then had to be loaded onto trains before being sent on their way. It's slowdowns like this that Germany can't afford to allow if NATO is at war with Russia, and Funke knows it. So does the European Union, or EU, which Le Monde says set itself a goal of requiring just 5 days to move a military convoy across the continent. It's nowhere near reaching that goal. According to General Fabrice Viola of the French Centre for Operations Support and Logistics, the average time required is closer to tens of days. It goes without saying that Russia could do a lot of damage in those extra days above the target that are currently needed to ship armor and other equipment to the front lines. These types of issues simply can't exist if NATO is to follow the strategic routes that form the backbone of its collective plans to tackle Russia. Though you might like to think that Germany would lift such bureaucratic red tape as weight restrictions on its roads in the event of war with Russia, these sorts of issues plague Europe. For Funke, planning for a war with Russia has to start with dealing with these logistical issues. He brings up what it would take for UK troops to reach the front lines of that war via Germany as an example. If British troops had to move through Germany, they'd come via a port like Emden or Bremerhaven, and from there they'd be guided to the eastern flank, wherever that ends up being, Funke told the outlet, adding, "On the way, they need refueling. The soldiers need to rest, to eat, and potentially to receive medical treatment." These mentions of medical treatment and civilian preparedness are going to be important. You'll learn why soon. The good news amid all of this potential doom and gloom is that work is underway to improve NATO logistics, both within Germany and NATO itself. Back in June 2024, Militani reported that NATO was actively developing new corridors through which it could move troops in the event of a war with Russia. Back then, the main corridor would have seen the US troops arriving in Germany by way of Rotterdam, before being transported via rail through Germany and the Netherlands to Poland. Once there, the soldiers and equipment could be distributed along the Eastern Front. The outlet also reported that negotiations were underway to open up other ports to ensure that communication landlines can't be severed by Russia. These ports would potentially be in Italy, Turkey, and Greece, the outlet reported. From the age of this report, we can tell that the logistical question has been on NATO's collective mind for a long time, though some may be concerned that Funke is still highlighting it over 18 months later. By 2025, more plans were put into motion. A deep modernization of European transportation infrastructure was underway. That would include the development of a pipeline for fuel sent to troops that runs through Germany and into Poland and the Czech Republic. That pipeline already exists. It was developed during the Cold War, and it ends in the Lower Saxony and Ingolstadt region of Bavaria, though it needs development to serve as a true through line for fuel in a wartime situation. But again, there is a problem. That project will cost at least 21 billion euros, or about $25 billion, and its estimated completion date is in 2035. Long after Funke and Pistorius' proposed start of the war between Russia and NATO. Beyond this pipeline, Germany is also reportedly preparing a classified national defense strategy that it will enact in the event of a war. Obviously, we don't know the particulars of this strategy. However, United 24 media reports that it outlines multiple scenarios ranging from the kinds of hybrid warfare tactics we're seeing Russia utilize right now to potential precursors for a full-scale war. The current phase of the plan reportedly focuses on identifying threats, aligning interagency coordination, and strengthening logistical readiness. We don't know much more than that. Still, these are all indicators that Germany, and NATO by extension, are at least trying to prepare for a war that could come in as little as 2 years. Other preparations relate to two things we mentioned earlier in the video. medical planning and the reactivation of Germany's civilian preparedness. On the medical side, the Times points out that this is even harder than the logistical side of the impending war effort. For a start, NATO still needs to develop a plan to work out how many of the wounded will be sent to which of its member states once the war begins. Ideally, these medical states will be behind the front lines, meaning that whatever plan is created would have to be flexible to adapt to changes across the front lines. Germany would take on a large share of the medical burden, the Times says, which only adds another layer to its efforts to prepare for what some of its most prominent ministers and generals think is coming. Again, other NATO allies are doing their best to get ready. Back in June, Politico reported that many of NATO's frontier countries are preparing their hospitals for a wartime scenario. These are the Eastern Front countries where much of the initial, and NATO would hope only, fighting takes place. In Lithuania, for instance, the 2-day Iron Wolf exercise was created specifically to give medical staff an idea of what to expect from a wartime scenario. All of NATO's frontier countries are conducting exercises related to crisis response, Politico says, and they're also investing in ballistic helmets and vests, in addition to creating operating theaters that are underground and hopefully shielded from Russian bombs. Other countries aren't so prepared. According to a January 12th report in the I-Paper, the UK's Ministry of Defence has a £28 billion or around $38.6 billion funding gap in its budget that will inevitably affect its capabilities during a war with Russia. The National Health Service isn't ready at all, says the UK's Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Richard Knighton. If we ended up in an all-out conflict under NATO Article 5 and sustained mass casualties, the defence medical system is not set up to do that. It would have to plug into the National Health Service. But right now, we don't have a complete plan for how we would mobilise the National Health Service in the event of armed conflict at a NATO Article 5 level, Knighton said during an appearance at the Commons Defence Committee. It's clear that a lot more work is needed, at least in some NATO countries. And that fact is what makes Germany's 2 to 3 year prediction so terrifying. Returning to Germany, its armed forces have 5 hospitals and 1,800 beds, but they would likely be overwhelmed quickly in a war like the one Russia is waging in Ukraine. This is where the civilian aspect of Germany's preparedness needs to come into play, Funke says. He says that Germany needs to make some shifts back to Cold War days of West Germany to create a society that is ready to contribute wholly to a war effort. Funke speaks of standby agreements between Germany's national rail operator and the German government, which compelled the rail service to deliver trains on flat wagons for military service within 3 days of them being requested. It has to be said quite clearly that without civilian support within a total defense concept, we wouldn't be capable of defending ourselves, Funke tells the Times. And that concept of total defense may also be aided by Germany's plans to reintroduce something akin to mandatory military service among its young adults. Starting this January, all 18-year-olds in Germany will be sent a questionnaire asking them if they are interested in joining the country's armed forces. All of Germany's 18-year-old men will receive this form, though its receipt is voluntary for the country's women. From July 2027, Germany will also require all of its 18-year-old men to undergo medical exams to determine if they're fit enough for service, the BBC reports. France is doing something similar. It's introducing a 10-month voluntary military service scheme targeting people aged 18 and 19. If this is all starting to sound like NATO's European members are still underprepared for a war with Russia, especially one that could come as early as 2028, you may be right. But moves are being made. And according to News Sky, Germany also has a secret plan that it hopes will deter Putin from ever launching a war against NATO. That plan has been developed by German officers and involves sending 800 NATO troops to the Eastern Front. That's not the important part, though those troops could be a deterrent. What is important is that the plan encompasses the type of blurring between military and civilian lines that Funke says is important. The authors of the plan are blurring the line between civilian and military. The infrastructure, the army, and the legislation are being adapted to the logic of Cold War 2.0, News Sky reports. But again, these are just plans. Words on pieces of paper that may not be put into practice in time for a 2028 or 29 war with Russia. As for Russia, it's always difficult to figure out what Putin is planning. However, he's taking advantage of NATO bureaucracy with claims that there is a much easier way to prevent a war with Russia. During a 4.5-hour televised address in December, Putin was asked by the BBC if there would be any more special military operations should the one in Ukraine succeed. Putin responded, "There won't be any operations if you treat us with respect. If you respect our interests, just as we've always respected yours." How magnanimous of Russia's leader. Of course, Russia's interests appear to be the destruction of Ukraine and the retaking of other former Soviet territories, which are interests that NATO simply can't respect. And Putin knows it. He's playing to that fact. The question now is, are the German officers and generals correct about Russia's time frame for a war with NATO? If they are, then plans need to be put into practice. Because right now, Funke seems to believe that Germany, at the very least, isn't ready for what's coming. Of course, all of this assumes that Russia will even be in a position to attack NATO nations. That's a situation that is still very much up in the air, as Ukraine is making it harder for Putin to do anything like amass the type of force that he would need. Ukraine's drones are tearing through the Russian military so quickly that there may be nothing left for a war with NATO.
Picture the scenario. A massive swarm of Russian drones darkens the skies as it heads towards the Polish border on NATO's eastern flank. But NATO is prepared. Waiting to confront the swarm is a robot army, an AI-enabled network of automated surveillance systems, drones, robots, and missile systems. A major battle is about to take place, and the nearest military personnel are in control bunkers hundreds of miles away, acting largely as spectators as the machines they command go to war. Just a few years ago, this kind of scenario belonged strictly in the realm of science fiction. Now, it's rapidly becoming a reality. According to NATO top brass, the alliance is moving to boost its defenses along its borders with Russia by creating an AI-assisted automated zone that's not reliant on human ground forces. So let's take a closer look at the plan, some of the advanced new weapon systems that'll be used, and how this development might change the global security equation. Now, details of the plan were revealed by General Thomas Lowen, NATO's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. In an interview with German Sunday newspaper Welt am Sonntag in late January, he described a new multi-layered defense concept that would see NATO using advanced technologies to slow or stop invading forces in the earliest phases of a conflict. In essence, the idea is to create a buffer zone along NATO's borders with Russia and Belarus, using surveillance networks and remotely operated or semi-automated systems to provide the first line of detection against an incursion. This automated zone would act as a sort of hot zone for breaching enemy forces, according to Lowen. Now, if you were thinking that a robot army as the first line of defense is still decades away, or even a lofty pipe dream, think again. Programs to test out the proposed capabilities are reportedly already underway in Poland and Romania, with the intention of making the system operational right across NATO within as little as 2 years. That rapid pace of deployment underscores the urgency with which NATO is acting to bolster its defenses against Russian threats in general. A spate of drone incursions across Europe in the second half of 2025 exposed an alarming level of unpreparedness across the continent to deal with the emerging threat of drone warfare. In most cases, the European nations where the incursions occurred, such as Belgium, the Netherlands, France, and Denmark, struggled to cope with unknown drones loitering near airports and military bases, or simply breaching their airspace. Most lacked anti-drone defenses, while some were inhibited by existing legislation from taking appropriate action, like shooting them down. And in instances where NATO did shoot incoming drones down, such as when around 20 Russian drones breached Polish airspace last September, it was compelled to use missiles in much shorter supply and worth many times more than their targets. That might be worth it for one-off incidents, but it's hardly sustainable in a prolonged conflict. Just ask Ukraine. Nonetheless, while few of these drone incursions have been conclusively pinned on Russia, the message they delivered was clear. NATO's anti-drone defense needs a serious upgrade, and ASAP. Since then, in response to the challenge, there's been a flurry of anti-drone activity in NATO land, particularly in member nations located closest to Russia, and most of it's high-tech, to put it mildly. Even before the September drone incursions into Poland, General Chris Donahue, commander of US Army Europe and Africa, had announced NATO plans to establish an eastern flank deterrence line. This line would comprise interoperable sensors and command systems designed to integrate with any available hardware. Russia has conscription and numbers, he said in July. We have to counter that with technology. The Polish incursion seemed to have only sharpened NATO's resolve. In the immediate aftermath of these incursions, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen mentioned the concept of a drone wall to defend NATO's eastern flank in a State of the Union address. This drone wall, spanning 1,850 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, would be the bedrock of credible defense, part of a broader effort to protect the region from Russia. she said. EU Defence Commissioner Andrius Kubilius added that the project should be developed with input from Ukraine, which has unrivaled experience in combating drones as a result of its long-running war against Russia. As for the funding, European startups and universities are likely to be involved, with some of the funding coming from the EU's roughly $176 billion Safe Defence Loan Fund. The Drone Wall initiative aims to create a permanent early warning barrier along NATO's eastern frontier, a line of technological deterrence against Russian aggression and hybrid warfare. NATO member states are hardly lacking in air defences in general, but last fall's incursions exposed specific vulnerabilities against drones, which have become an increasingly staple part of Russian attacks. Systems like the IRIS-T and NASAM systems offer state-of-the-art protection against larger threats, such as crewed aircraft and cruise missiles. They can take down drones like Russia's Gerund long-range kamikaze drones with relative ease, but it's anything but cost-effective or sustainable. Each interceptor missile can cost hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, while Gerunds cost in the tens of thousands and can be produced in much greater quantities within much smaller timeframes. NATO members also have specific anti-drone systems, such as the Sky Ranger radar-directed gun system and the Gepard rapid-fire cannon system. These systems, and others in a similar vein, have proven to be effective at taking down Russian drones of all shapes and sizes in Ukraine. However, it would likely take tens of thousands of these systems to adequately protect NATO's interior, and thousands, plus the skilled manpower to operate them, to protect that 1,850-mile border. It's an undertaking that's simply not practical or feasible at this point. Ukraine has demonstrated, however, that one of the most effective and cost-effective methods of taking down Russian drones is by shooting cheap interceptor drones at them, i.e. drone versus drone. So the concept of a drone wall across NATO's eastern flank to combat Russian drones makes a lot of sense. It's affordable, scalable, can be implemented and iterated quicker than other more expensive solutions, and offers an excellent cost-to-kill ratio. Indeed, European defense companies are already taking their cue from Ukraine's experience to build out interceptor drone systems themselves. But before we go any further, we want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Private Internet Access, aka PIA, the world's most transparent VPN provider, trusted by over 30 million users worldwide. PIA is a leader in online privacy. Whenever you browse on an unprotected device, you're transmitting a great amount of information out into the open, which can be viewed by various different entities before reaching the website. VPN hides your IP address and encrypts your internet connection, shielding your data from your ISP, network administrators, and even government surveillance. Without a VPN, browsing online is a lot like sending a private message to a group chat. Everyone can see what you're doing. But with PIA, your activity is protected inside a secure, encrypted tunnel. Their no-logs policy has been proven multiple times in court and verified by an independent audit conducted by Deloitte, one of the world's leading auditing firms. Beyond security, PIA offers real freedom online, whether you're traveling abroad or just trying to access content not available in your region. PIA has you covered with servers in over 91 countries and all 50 US states. It also supports P2P file sharing and works with all major streaming services, so you can enjoy more content from anywhere. I personally use PIA while gaming to connect to local servers and reduce latency. It's also great for unlocking region-specific content across platforms like Netflix, Hulu, and more. PIA is available across all major platforms: Windows, macOS, Linux, iOS, Android, and more. And with just one subscription, you can protect an unlimited number of devices at the same time, perfect for securing your entire digital life. Right now, there's an exclusive offer for our viewers. Go to piavpn.com/themilitaryShow, also in the description, to get 83% off private internet access, bringing it down to just $2.03 a month. Plus, you'll receive 4 extra months completely free. And if you're still on the fence, they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, and 24/7 customer support is always available to help. So go try private internet access right now. Your privacy deserves no less, And with PIA, you're in good hands. In September, the UK announced the Octopus project, a joint venture with Ukraine to produce Ukrainian-designed interceptor drones in the UK for use in Ukraine. A month later, German startup Titan Technology signed a deal with Germany's Defense Procurement Office to develop a system to protect critical infrastructure. The system reportedly involves AI-enabled interceptor drones that feature autonomous target acquisition and cost significantly less than traditional air defense systems. But while interceptor drones will almost certainly form an important part of the drone wall, and indeed the newly announced autonomous zone, there's a lot more to both than just that. The drone wall, according to military experts, will be an integrated system that connects different sensors and surveillance equipment with various capabilities to detect and deal with drone threats. And it's a similar story when it comes to the newly announced autonomous zone. But the idea is to fend off much more than just drones. It's a multi-layered defense concept that would see NATO using advanced technologies to slow or stop invading forces in the earliest phases of a conflict, whatever form they take. According to Lowen, this integrated system will include surveillance networks and remotely operated or semi-automated systems to provide the first line of detection against an incursion. The automated AI-powered system will use sensors to detect enemy sources and then activate defenses, including interceptor drones, semi-autonomous combat vehicles, land-based robots, and automatic air defenses and anti-missile systems. Intelligence collection would rely on a mix of fixed and mobile platforms, including radar, acoustic, and optical sensors, supported by data from satellites, drones, and reconnaissance aircraft. The sensors, located on the ground, in space, in cyberspace, and in the air, according to Lowen, will cover an area of several thousand miles. They'll detect Russian troop movements or the deployment of weapons and inform all NATO member states in real time. Then, once the incoming targets are locked, the system would begin taking them down. Most of this would happen automatically, controlled by AI or by remote control from command centers potentially hundreds of miles away. Lowen stressed that the AI-guided system wasn't meant to replace NATO's existing defenses, but rather to bolster its current weapon systems and forward-deployed forces. Moreover, any action involving lethal weapons would always be under human responsibility, according to the general. That would remove one of the more dystopian aspects of the plan. For good reason, science fiction stories ranging from the 1970 movie Colossus, The Forbidden Project, to the more recent Black Mirror series have cautioned against the perils of fully autonomous lethal weapon systems, or LAWS for short. The potential for this kind of AI to start thinking for itself is precisely what promoted former Google CEO Eric Schmidt to recently suggest that the best solution would be pulling the plug. However, as the aforementioned movie and series warned, pulling the plug on an AI system that can decide for itself to kill you is likely to be easier said than done. So, it's a good thing NATO intends to retain human control over its proposed automated defenses. And speaking of Schmidt, notwithstanding his concerns about the potential risks of AI, his company, SwiftBeat LLC, and its subsidiary, White Stork, produces what's likely to be a key component for both the drone wall and the autonomous zone, the MEROPS system. Reports started emerging in mid-2025 that this secretive system was being tested in Ukraine to great effect. Then, in November, it was revealed that both Poland and Romania had begun deploying the US-made system as an element of the drone wall, with Denmark also set to adopt the system. The goal is to make the border with Russia so heavily armed that Moscow would be deterred from ever crossing it, from Norway in the north to Turkey in the south, one NATO official reportedly said. According to Colonel Mark McClellan, Assistant Chief of Staff for Operations at NATO Allied Land Command, what the system does is give us very accurate detection. It's able to target the drones and take them down at a low cost. It's a lot cheaper than flying an F-35 to take them down with a missile. General Lowen concurred, saying the system gives commanders time to assess the threat and decide to shoot or not shoot, and that MEROPS is versatile enough to defend both critical infrastructure like airports and military units in combat zones. So, what is the MEROPS system? And why is it such a compelling part of NATO's Eastern Flank defense equation? In a nutshell, it's an advanced anti-drone complex designed around the company's bespoke Surveyor interceptor drones. Each MEROPS unit includes a command station, launch platforms, and a fleet of Surveyor drones. These interceptor drones can either operate autonomously or be remotely piloted, and are equipped with radars, electro-optical infrared cameras, and AI algorithms to detect and classify small drones. Having identified and fixed on their targets, they then take them down by smashing into them at high speed in mid-air. The entire system is compact enough to fit in the back of a mid-sized pickup truck and can detect and intercept drones using AI-guided navigation, even when satellite or electronic communications are jammed. Training exercises conducted in Poland showed that MEROPS can even be launched from standard pickup trucks, highlighting its supreme suitability for shoot-and-scoot type operations. Another compelling aspect of the system is its small operating crew and training period. A full crew consists of 4 personnel, a commander, a pilot, and 2 technicians, and their training cycle reportedly only takes 2 weeks. By comparison, training of Ukrainian crews to operate the US-made Patriot missile system is estimated to take at least several months. While full technical specifications remain undisclosed, the Surveyor drones reportedly reach speeds of over 175 miles per hour. That's considered fast enough to intercept jet-powered drones such as the Russian Geran 3, which can exceed 190 miles per hour. The drones are also reported to be resistant to electronic jamming, a claim that admittedly has not yet been independently verified. Most importantly, they're reportedly very effective at taking down Russian drones. By November, Ukrainian outlets were reporting that the Ukrainian armed forces had already used the MEROPS to shoot down more than 1,000 Russian Geran-type drones. Clearly, as demonstrated by its deployment in Poland, Romania, and Denmark, this success hasn't gone unnoticed by NATO. It's likely to be entirely non-coincidental that the proposed capabilities of the autonomous zone are being tested in the very same countries where the MEROPS is known to have been deployed, Poland and Romania. As for the other components of the proposed autonomous zone and robot army, at this point we can but speculate. It's a pretty safe bet, though, that the Maven Smart System NATO, MSS NATO for short, will be at the heart of it. The deal with Palantir Technologies to implement this next-generation system into NATO was finalized in April 2025, in what NATO described as one of the most expeditious in its history, taking only 6 months from outlining the requirement to acquiring the system. Since Allied Command Operations was expected to begin using the system within 30 days of its acquisition, it's likely to already be deeply embedded into NATO systems across the board, as intended. MSS NATO is an artificial intelligence platform designed to enhance battlefield operations through intelligence fusion, targeting capabilities, and accelerated decision-making for the Alliance's military forces. It integrates large language models, generative AI, and machine learning, automating intelligence fusion by analyzing data from multiple sources, including sensors, satellites, ISR systems, and human reports. This enables a small team of 20 to 50 soldiers to process battlefield intelligence that previously required hundreds or even thousands of analysts. Other AI-enabled systems that could be implemented into the autonomous zone alongside the MEROPS include the Switchblade 300/600 AI-guided autonomous targeting loitering munitions and the Kratos XQ-58A Valkyrie jet-powered drone used in the US Air Force and Marine Corps Loyal Wingman program. But that's purely speculation at this point. What isn't speculation is that NATO certainly isn't alone in developing and deploying AI-enabled and autonomous weapon systems. In fact, given the pace of similar development amongst its major rivals, it's probably a very good thing that NATO is taking action at such a rapid rate. For example, North Korea made waves last year with the ominous announcement that it would be integrating AI into its nuclear arsenal. But it's more ominous than that. A recent report by South Korea's Institute for National Security Strategy found that North Korea has moved beyond experimental AI development into practical deployment in systems like AI-equipped suicide drones, as well as facial recognition, voice synthesis, multi-object tracking, and real-time video analysis. While the full scale of North Korea's AI military capabilities remains uncertain, the intent and strategic emphasis are clear. Kim Jong-un is using AI to project power, to overcome resource limitations, and challenge global military and cyber norms. But, as in most things, the scale of the threat from North Korea pales in comparison to that presented by China. China has been aggressively advancing its development of AI-enabled and automated weapon systems, positioning itself at the forefront of military AI innovation. The People's Liberation Army, or PLA, is rapidly integrating AI across domains, including unmanned aerial, ground, sea, and subsea systems, with a focus on autonomy, swarm operations, and human-machine teaming. Advanced UAVs like the Tai-Hong series and the Lookout 2 unmanned missile boats feature growing capabilities for coordinated AI-driven swarm attacks. Norinco's Intelligent Precision Strike System, which autonomously dispatches drones, tracks targets, and assigns strikes in real time, is currently undergoing tests, and the PLA is deploying AI for target recognition, predictive maintenance, logistics automation, and real-time battlefield decision-making, using systems like TNG Yao, a cloud-based decision-making AI. But, at least for now, while the US may view China as its biggest rival, for NATO, the number one threat is still Russia. And Russia appears to be developing AI-enabled and automated weapon systems just as aggressively. As part of the country's massive military rearmament strategy, President Vladimir Putin ordered significant changes to Russia's defense production priorities in May 2025, including the acceleration of unmanned systems, AI capabilities, and directed energy weapons. Its Military-Industrial Commission has set a goal of deriving 30% of combat power from AI-enabled robotic platforms by 2030. Russia has already introduced nuclear-capable autonomous systems, including the Poseidon underwater drone, Avangard hypersonic glide vehicle, and Kinzhal hypersonic missile, all of which incorporate AI for navigation, target selection, and evasion. It's also increasingly integrating AI in both its long-range and frontline drones, and its Automated Control System, or ACS, is an attempt to emulate the US's JADC2, integrating AI to process battlefield data in real time, enabling faster decision-making. Put it all together, and the notion of robot armies squaring off is anything but science fiction. At this rate, it looks like we're just a few years away from NATO and Russian weapon systems waging war against each other with very little human involvement. Let's hope that the plug doesn't need to be pulled to prevent a Skynet-type scenario from developing. We'll of course keep you updated with all the latest developments, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel to stay up to date. Thanks for watching.